Great. Well, a very good evening. We were just debating whether I should say evening or late afternoon, but as the light is dimming, I'm going to go with an evening. So welcome to you all. Fantastic to see a packed Sheldonian Theatre. Here we are at the start of 2026, and this is our, of course, first Sheldonian Series of the year here in Hilary term. And we are continuing our exploration for the theme of this year, which, as you know, is about power. And tonight, it's about the power of activism. In our world today, there is no shortage of issues about which to feel passionate, angry, or utterly outraged. From climate change to democracy to peace, we are living through very uncertain times. And many of us can feel a sense of frustration about decisions not being taken, or indeed the wrong decisions being taken. It can be easy, of course, to feel helpless, to believe that there is nothing we can do. But it is also possible to take a different view, to reject such helplessness. When change has happened in the world, it is often because people have decided to organise and drive change. The women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century, independence movements across the world, the cause of civil rights in the United States, or anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the Velvet Revolution, LGBTQ rights, action for climate and the environment. What then does activism today look like? And what role should activism play in contemporary society? At a time when democratic norms are under great stress, when matters such as climate are so urgent, and when there are wars and threats to peace. And how, as a university community, should we understand our relationship with social change and progress? Well, tonight, these are some of the questions, among many more, that I know tonight's fabulous panel will explore. And guiding us through will be our wonderful moderator for the evening, Professor Julius, and the panel who he will introduce momentarily. But you too are part of the conversation. So there will be, as always, a chance to ask questions, and I encourage you, particularly the students, to get involved. So without further ado, enjoy your evening, and please join me in welcoming our moderator, Julius, and the panel.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, and good evening to everybody. Joining me this evening, we have a brilliant panel. We are also going to be joined by Baroness Shami Chakrabarti. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us in person tonight, but we're going to cut in some video clips of her at the appropriate time. In person, we have the brilliant panel of Dominique immediately next to me, who is an environmental activist, writer, and speaker, who was telling me before we started that she's appeared on stages to crowds of many, many thousands, tens of thousands of people. And I was pointing out that I think at my last series of lectures on remedies for breach of trust, I might have had 5 people in the room. So obviously, we have very similar experiences on that front. Next to Dominique is Munira Mirza, a former director of the No. 10 Policy Unit from between 2019 and 2022, and the current chief executive of the organisation Civic Future. Then we have Professor Federica Genovese, who is a fellow of St Anthony's College and a professor of political science and international relations here at the University of Oxford. And last but by no means least, we have Shermar Pryce, who is from the University of Oxford's Student Union and who is president for Communities and Common Rooms. A couple of very brief things from me before we start. Please do turn off your mobile phones as we go through. Flight mode or off is better than silent in my experience. You guys are all an important part of today's proceedings, and if you hear something you like, please do feel free to applaud or say hear, hear. You don't have to listen in silence. This is going to be an interactive event. And lastly, we have a lot of written questions, and I'm going to try and bring as many of those in as I can. But also, we do really want to hear from you and your reactions live. I will try, when I can, to get audience questions in. When it is your turn to ask a question, please, first of all, do ask a question. And second of all, please try and keep it relatively brief so we can get more people in. Without further ado, though, I think we're going to start with a couple of quick-fire questions. I'll probably go down the line and back up it. So my first question, and we'll start with Shermar, please, is can you give us an example of when an instance of activism has succeeded?
Yep. So my example would be, we're going back to the pandemic. Just after March 2020, when the first lockdown was announced, many students in secondary and primary school who were on free school meals were at the risk of food poverty as that provision would have ended. And the football player, now at Barcelona, I believe Marcus Rashford, started his campaign alongside the charity Fair Share, I believe, which initially was Manchester-based, but then expanded to the rest of the UK. And as a result of his lobbying, whether it be open letters or collaborating with corporate interests, so Tesco and other big supermarkets managed to get the government to expand their provision and reverse decisions to stop that provision during holidays, and that unlocked hundreds of millions of funding. I'd say the campaign was so successful based on, in Parliament, Boris Johnson himself said that Marcus Rashford was a more effective leader of the opposition than Keir Starmer, so I think that tells you a lot there.
Fantastic, thank you. Federica.
Great, thanks for being here, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm a climate politics researcher, so my expertise is in the politics and policies of the environment and climate change. So I will anchor my illustration of how activism has succeeded recently on the type of disinvestment that is being going on championed by universities on the fossil fuel front. So like disinvestment from fossil fuel has been a very difficult thing for institutions to confront themselves with. There is a lot of money that goes into the way we invest in carbon forcing assets, and more than 16,000 institutions, universities, but also pension funds and faith groups have disinvested in recent years, and that's a lot of money. It's the equivalent of 40 trillion, I believe, US dollars at this point, that have been taken away from long-term fossil fuel investments, and this was really thanks to the groundwork and the bottom-up pressure that has come from institutions like the one we're in.
Thank you very much. Munira.
So I will choose a contemporary example as well. I think the farmers' protests in the last year about the government's proposed inheritance tax changes. Sorry, apologies, I don't know. Can you hear me?
I think now we can, yes.
Okay, I'll start again. So I'm going to choose the farmers' protests that took place over the last year, which I think have had quite a big impact in that they've forced the government to make a U-turn on their proposals on inheritance tax. It's not that hard, it seems, to get the government to do U-turns, but I think they were very successful. I work in Westminster, so I saw their various protests. I saw them bringing the tractors in on the streets, and I think that it was a very good example of very large numbers of people coming out and demonstrating strength of feeling, collective feeling about a policy, and it was effective.
Thank you very much. Dominique.
As a climate justice activist, my example is something that I've been part of and witnessed recently here in the UK, similarly to other examples. I'm part of the Stop Rosebank campaign, and very recently we took the previous government's decision to approve the Rosebank oil field to court and won that. And due to that court decision, we now have a lot more power in ending the oil field for good, and it also sets a large precedent when it comes to ending fossil fuel expansion itself and creating the conditions that we need to survive and thrive within the climate crisis. And very quickly, the Rosebank oil field is the largest proposed oil field in the North Sea, and if it goes ahead, the emissions would equal to 23 of the lowest income countries combined. So it was a really huge win, and this was built from grassroots movement, very much bottom up, building communities, protests, and building that community resilience and resources, being able to take that to court. And that was a really amazing moment, I think, that really showcases the power of activism.
Thank you very much. Some interesting examples there, both individual action, group action, public protests and litigation, both as vehicles for making a difference. I am a law professor, so forgive me for being slightly invidious, but we're now going to go back down the line and come up with brief examples of instances where we think activism has failed. Would you like to go first?
have thought about this, and sorry, but I don't have a direct answer. I think defining failure in activism is a very difficult thing to do. So if your aim is to get this law passed in a year or to stop the climate crisis in this amount of time, then you could look at things and say, okay, this is a failure. But when we think widely about the purpose of activism, it's also about influencing public opinion, it's about rallying more people, and it's about really planting the seeds and paving forward a way for the future. And activism in itself is something that's very difficult to measure the success of until you're years or even maybe a decade away from seeing what's happened.
Thank you. Munira.
So I've been involved in quite a lot of activism that has failed. The first protest I ever went on was around the corner about 30 years ago. It was a march against student tuition fees, and that failed very, very badly because students are paying it now. But actually, I would point to some of the more disruptive tactics of environmental activists today. I think that they are probably becoming quite counterproductive because they are alienating large sections of the population. They're much more disruptive. They're kind of disrupting people's everyday lives, in some ways quite extreme. And I think it points to the difference of legitimate and illegitimate tactics. So sometimes people can feel very passionate about a cause, but their methods, their approach can have the opposite effect to what they intend.
Thank you. And I think we're going to get on to questions about legitimate and illegitimate tactics later on. So that's a good launch pad for that. Federica.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something that is very similar. I think that as a political scientist, I do think a lot about measurement and how to measure things. And it is absolutely true, like Dominique was saying, that the hard, part of assessing and evaluating activism is really trying to understand what the successful outcome is. Presumably, it is policy change. It's changing the world. It's making it better for the public good, for most of the people. But it is very hard to determine who the majority of the people are in very divided societies. It is also very hard to pin down sort of what would be long-term successful outcomes of activism, meaning presumably we want policy change, but policy, it's very hard, it's institutionally very hard to achieve. Like it takes a long time, especially in democracies, to get to a policy outcome. So maybe success is agenda setting, agenda seeding. And in that sense, that's where it gets a little bit harder to really assess, for example, how unsuccessful some of the more radical movements that we were mentioning earlier have been. I tend to agree, and I think that there is a lot of data from public polling, from surveys, they point that the more extreme, violent, radical forms of activism in general, or environmental activism specifically, are having a backlash effect. But it is also very hard to know if in the long run they actually have seeded ideas that actually are sticking. So it's true that there is a backlash effect in the short run, but in the long run there may actually be something that sticks and that eventually makes people sort of turn their opinion on the issue.
Yeah, one's minded of the old turn of phrase, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. Shermar, wrap us up, please.
Yeah, so my example is similar to your first example, well, insofar as it's the same government, was the 2003 Stop the War protest, so which was the largest protest our country's ever seen, somewhere between 1 to 2 million people, immobilizing a large part of the capital, yet, 3 months later, we still invaded Iraq. And I think that really showcased how, showcase that activism is more than just a protest, that, for it to be successful, you need to materially change the incentives of the institution which you're trying to get to change their position, and clearly that didn't work there. So.
Thank you. So I think the relationship between democracy and activism is something we're going to talk about. So that's started us off really well. Thank you all for your answers. We're going to go to our first sort of more formal question now, and hopefully I'm going to queue up a video answer from Baroness Chakrabarti. We asked her the, in retrospect, rather abstract tutorial question of what she understood activism to be.
Activism is any political expression, particularly when it's designed to persuade others, to come together with others, to further a cause. I consider myself an activist. I know that it's often considered a bit of a dirty word or a term of abuse, but I am very comfortable with the idea that activism, including protest, are a healthy part of democracy and a means of getting democracy when you don't have it. It's not just about elections every few years, it is about organising people, spreading ideas, persuasion, vital to every freedom struggle in human history.
So 2 things, panel, that jumped out to me from that answer was the link that Shami made between persuading others and activism. She said it's particularly when it's designed to persuade. But do we think that there is a particular link between activism and persuasion, or do we think that there are wider things activism can do? It occurs to me that arguably sometimes just a show of rage is a good enough thing to do if it has to be done in the right circumstances. I also wonder about the link between democracy and activism, because Shami linked the two twice. Where does that answer leave activists in non-democratic countries? So why don't we start with Federica?
Yeah, great. Those are great reflections. I think that I will start from the second question, the second point that you raised, which I think ultimately is really the core of the issue here, like the relationship between activism and democracy. Again, political science, sorry, apologies, but yeah, that's who I am. And I'll default into speaking about the type of empirical data that we have out there that can give us a sense of whether democracy and activism go hand in hand. And a lot of studies out there actually show that the sort of like willingness to create some noise and like the capacity for civil society to organize and to generate some type of social turbulence, especially within legal sort of methods and, you know, within certain parameters, especially if non-violent, is very strictly correlated with high levels of rule of law, of democratic accountability. So I think that there is something out there that tells us that clearly activism is a fundamental dimension of democracy. I think it is possible to have activism in non-democracies. In fact, sometimes it's, you know, this sort of like fire that sparks, you know, changes that are fundamentally important if we all believe that democracy is actually the type of public good providing state of governance that we hope most people will enjoy at some point. And it is also possible to have democracies that backtrack, you know, from allowing activism, still remaining somewhat democracies. But I think the evidence is relatively clear that there needs to be some healthy capacity for civil society to make noise. And sometimes those noises, those actions will seem irrational. Sometimes they will border violence. They will bend, you know, legal parameters. But not allowing for that, I think, brings us in a world, in a sort of counterfactual world where actually democracy is very empty.
Shermar, social turbulence. That's a term we've just heard, but not one that Shami Chakrabarti used. Where do you see the role of creating social turbulence in the concept of activism?
Yeah, so, you know, going back to, I guess, I hinted at a sort of cynical view of activism and how it can be effective is what I view as sort of a cost-benefit analysis. Like, does the benefit from moving outweigh the cost of it? And I think with sort of social, you know, noise and outrage, that definitely does play a part. But going back to what you were saying about democracy, I think activism is a lot more possible in sort of legal, non-violent ways in democracies, just because that social outrage can be an indicator of how people, are going to exercise their vote in an election, for example, and that changes the cost-benefit analysis for a government in a democratic country. And in a country without that sort of mechanism, you need a bit more than just sort of people making noise. You need to sort of be able to shift the minds or the actions of a centralized authority who has like an extreme monopoly on violence. So I think that's my view on the link between democracy and activism and social rage and the like.
Sure, so that's going back towards the persuasion idea that Shami was bringing up. Dominique, your story in terms of becoming an activist is publicly well known. What does activism mean to you?
Activism to me, and where my kind of theory of change is all about, it's just acting in any capacity or way that you can or you feel drawn to. But when it comes to how activism is literally, changing the very social fabric that we exist in, it exists in forms of protest, it exists in forms of more radical strategies of activism, in non-violent disobedience. It exists in the courtrooms as well, even going all the way from a very small idea. For example, recently there was a group of Pacific Island students who, from their classroom, managed to mobilize a movement to take all the way to the International Court of Justice, and therefore have them release their very first climate advisory opinion, which really set a huge precedent, especially from young people leading that. But I think in general, when we think about activism and all of the good progressive things that it has now given us, me speaking on this stage at university as a young woman in itself is a result of decades of incredible activism. It's formed, the variety of forms that we see, I think, is to be completely expected, even when there are certain strategies that we don't agree with. It's looking at how not only does it influence public opinion, but the seeds it's planting, and also on multiple levels of society. And just on a point earlier, I also think in terms of activism, we sometimes see past examples in more maybe rose-tinted glasses, or how the public perceive them. But even when we look at things such as the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, particularly in that era, he was heavily disliked by the majority of the population, but his legacy still remains. And I think we do have to be critical about the different kind of forms of activism we see and how effective it is, but to have a variety of strategies and methods that are coming out, and all of the kind of beautiful variety that we have, that we see within a movement, I think is very, very important.
Thank you. So that's a very broad, potentially very broad definition of activism, which leads to the next question, which is, Munira, you're an activist then, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I have causes, I have things that I try and influence. Obviously, I've worked in government, which is a very different position to be in.
Is that not a form of activism?
Well, possibly, yes. You're trying to affect change. I think first of all, it's worth saying not all activism is progressive and left-wing. It's a way of trying to apply political pressure. So there are right-wing movements that will apply activism. There are forms of activism that we might not agree with, but are completely legitimate. So as an example, when I was growing up in the north of England, there were marches by the BNP, the British National Party. It was a far-right party. They were legitimate forms of activism, but not the kind of activism I personally liked or would agree with. And it is just it's a methodology, it's a process. So that's I think one thing just to point out, activism is not in and of itself always virtuous, and you have to judge it on the content and the legitimacy of the tactics. I think there is a difference between activism that is about persuasion and trying to build collective support, and the kinds of protests that Dominique has talked about and others, the civil rights movement marches, the marches in India against British rule, they were applying political pressure through collective will. I think then there is a difference from what I would call illegitimate activism, which is trying to coerce in some way and use tactics or disruption that might intimidate or harass, or effectively saying, we care about this issue so much that it is almost irrelevant what the public think. We want to impose our view. And that, I think, is against a kind of democratic culture. If you are in a democracy, I think it is very hard to justify those kinds of tactics. Obviously, if you live in a police state, if you live in an authoritarian society where you do not have the power through the vote to exercise political pressure in that way, then the tactics are different. You have to judge it in context. Even then, there are lots of examples in history of democratic movements that have used non-violent means, that have used collective protest. I was just saying to Federica that, again, 30 years ago here in Oxford, I went to see Václav Havel speak at St. Anthony's, who led a democracy movement in Czechoslovakia when it was still part of the kind of Eastern Bloc. So there are examples, even then in a police state, where building support, the act of politics, is to go out and persuade. And that, I think, it makes it extremely powerful, and much more powerful than, I think, some of the kind of tactics that I think you see today.
Okay, so I think we need to go on quite soon and examine in more detail this link between activism and democracy. But before we do, I wonder if anyone here who's purely on the basis of what we've heard so far has any question that they'd like to ask. It's okay if you don't, but it occurs to me that now might be a good time to introduce some questions from the floor. If you do have a question, stick your hand up and we will get a mic to you. On the front row, please. Oh, thank you very much. If you could keep the question relatively brief, we'd appreciate that.
Hi. So my question actually relates to the farmers' strike. I know you were saying it was a really effective form of activism, but then also were saying that disruptive techniques weren't always the best. Well, I live in Oxford, and I've seen the tractors. It was very disruptive along libraries, along Queen's Lane, but it was still effective. So what is the line? Is the line personal opinion? Is the line how many people it affects? Is the line... So what is the line and where is it?
Thank you. Should we take multiple questions, or would anyone like to answer that straight away?
I can come back on it quickly. I think it's a very good question. I think the farmers' protests were authorised protests, so they applied for permission. The police were able to police them effectively. There was no harm. They were generally very well behaved. They didn't happen every single week, and therefore they weren't. You could argue that it was. It's always a trade-off with democracy. The balance between allowing people to protest and allowing people to use the major roads in the city. But I think on balance that they did it well, and they kept public support. I think you can see examples also of public protests where they haven't been authorised, and it's made it very difficult for people to get, in some cases, ambulances to get to hospital, pregnant women to get medical attention, people to get to funerals and so on. That, I think, then does alienate the public more.
Shermar.
Yeah, I was going to say, to answer your question, that I think that it's actually entirely subjective, right? It depends on how much you care about the issue at hand. So, for the climate change and Extinction Rebellion protests, if you're genuinely of the belief that the government is contributing to the end of humanity, right, via whatever policy, then, I can see it completely being legitimate to disrupt in any way if you think you're actually bringing the end to that. Likewise, if we go to some of the biggest movements like the suffragette movement, that was the essential political emancipation of half the population. I think a lot of us look back at some of the radical tactics there, throwing yourself, under horse carriages and the like, as legitimate now, but at the time, that was treasonous in some respects. So I think it's entirely subjective. It just depends on how much you care about it at the end of the day.
Would you like to say anything in response, please?
Yeah, no, I'll go quickly. I think, definitely, what you were saying also about it being subjective, and also, I think in an era where activism is being repressed more, and there are pushes to have laws in that really take away that freedom of activism. I think then, and kind of looking at different laws in history, we ask ourselves, does what is legal and acceptable necessarily correlate to what is morally right? And how activism can exist, especially in societies where it's very difficult to protest, and for them to kind of go against that and maybe break the law in that way, you know, it's, when we look at it that way with a critical eye, it's not always so black and white, I think.
Please.
So I would disagree. I think that there's always a risk when you care very passionately about a cause that you think your moral certainty, I know what's right and I know what needs to be done, then overrides everybody else's decision and ability to choose. And I think that is then the road towards fundamentalism, where you impose your views on others. And I think that has become a kind of almost like a slogan. You know, well, democracy doesn't work. Let's bypass democracy. Let's use these tactics. And ultimately, you are privileging your own view of what is correct over everybody else's. And I think there are a lot of risks to that. I also think, actually, historically, if you look at things like the suffragette movement, there are quite a few historians now who would say that those very disruptive tactics probably delayed the introduction of the women's vote because it alienated so many people. It made them question and doubt whether the women who were campaigning for it should get the vote. And there was a lot of argument within the suffragette movement. You know, people like Millicent Fawcett said this is actually harming us. So, you know, if you disavow or if you try and almost bypass the democratic process, I think you end up undermining your own cause.
Federica, can I ask you, one set of protests that hasn't been mentioned so far would have been the post-2016 Brexit referendum protests in favour of a second referendum or remaining in the European Union. And a lot of people saw those protests as involving a direct rejection of a democratic decision. Now, obviously, people were capable of articulating why they didn't think an advisory referendum result was a decision that had to be obeyed, but a lot of people might have perceived it as rejecting an outcome of democracy. So going back towards some of the ideas we were discussing earlier, what is that link? Can we go further in that link between democracy and activism, and does activism involve rejecting democracy at times?
Yeah, I think that democracies work best when incremental changes are possible, and underperform when there are very big swings, you know, shocks, external shocks, or very dramatic policy changes. Brexit was such a shock. And I think what this created was besides further polarizing the British society, because let's remember that the vote was 52-48, so, you know, like polarized clearly. But also it created these waves of backlash over what was a democratic, you know, outcome from a referendum. And that's really where you start seeing democracies cracking. And that's, so I think that more than can we see, you know, democracy surviving activism, or should democracies bar activism, I think when activism gets to be weaponized by very polar parts of society, that's a symptom of a democracy underperforming. So for me, what those protests have constituted, and the fact that we've had a very long, difficult conversation, really, truly, almost tribal political divisions between Leavers and Remainers in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, is a symptom that the UK democracy was not ready for the type of shock that Brexit brought. So in many ways, the activism that we have seen and that manifested afterwards was just a spinning out of control because there was a democratic system that wasn't really capable of doing what a democracy should do, which is just process, accept that there are different opinions, accept that there would be, grievances that would need to be voiced by those that have lost a referendum, but then we move on. But I actually think that sometimes the more radical activism is a symptom of the fact that democracy is not working right.
That's a very striking proposition. Shermar, how do you feel about it?
So, I kind of disagree with the framing that it was anti-democratic in any sense to protest after the result, ask for the result to be reversed via a second referendum and stuff, because it's sort of it's assuming a very, I think, strange definition of what is democratic and what is a democracy, right? The democratic process is not just a decision is made, that is democracy. We're not going to talk about it again. If you protest this, you're anti-democratic. Like we don't treat elections in that way, right? Like after, depending on your political persuasion, everyone has a sort of most hated politician, and when they were elected, I'm sure you thought, no, let's run this again. This is terrible. This person needs to be removed. Like that was a democratic decision. But I think democracy is, that is a part of democracy, not challenging decisions as in saying they're illegitimate, but challenging the outcome of that and saying, I want my way this time around. That's what democracy is.
Sure, I will resist the temptation to ask the panel to name their most hated politician. Although I might be able to guess some of the answers. Federica, though.
I just wanted to clarify, I didn't mean, so the opposite of democracy, it would be easy to think that it's anti-democracy, it's autocracy. But actually, there is a vacuum. Autocracies and democracies are quite separate, and then there is, in political science, we talk about democratic backsliding. And that does not imply that when a democracy is underperforming, it's becoming autocratic. I don't think that's what it was. But it was a democracy that was not healthy. And I think that is what happens if you start questioning the fact that a democratic result, it was the outcome of the referendum of 2016, for all intents and purposes, by legal standards, it was a democratic, transparent, and non-corrupted outcome. But you start questioning that you're actually questioning much more, for example, why the referendum was called and how the campaign was done. And those are fundamental pieces of the democratic process of getting to the vote. So I just want to make sure that I'm not saying that the type of activism that came after in recent years, the UK is not anti-democratic, but there are symptoms of democracy under stress and the process of backsliding, which in the long run can lead to big regime changes. But certainly it does not look like a healthy democracy. That's what I meant.
Thank you. So I have a question for you two, but I'm going to hopefully queue it up with a question from the audience. So let's hope that Giovanna Chuong is here to ask. Is that you? Fantastic. Would you be prepared to ask your question, please? Hold it. You might have to hold it quite close. I'm not sure.
It's on now? Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Hi, thank you for being here with us and answering our questions. My question is, what is the role of public protest within activism, and when is public protest more effective than activism that happens within institutions?
Thank you very much. So I think if I start with Munira first, as someone who was inside government responding to public protests, but also private, should we say in a neutral sense, lobbying. And then if I come to you for your experience of how, when you're finally presented with decision makers who are prepared to listen, how receptive you find them. So perhaps Munira first, please.
So, both public, can people hear me?
I think it may be off.
Might be another mic over there. Yeah. We'll get through.
Okay.
There we go.
So both could be very powerful. I've definitely been in government, and thousands of people on the street cannot be ignored. Letter writing, petitions can't be ignored. They're not the only thing that apply pressure. And sometimes I think what's very hard when you're involved in a protest and you care about it, and there seem to be tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people involved on the streets, it's hard to understand why doesn't government just listen and do what we're saying. And I think you have to ask yourself, as you said earlier, Shermar, about incentives. Are there other imperatives? What about the people who aren't protesting, the people who are silent but who might not agree? I think the government is often trying to balance the different stakeholders or constituencies in society. Activism within institutions is interesting. There's a lot of lobbying that goes on, both legitimate and some less legitimate, but being able to influence politicians directly, often through argument, making a case. We were talking earlier about how academics have been very involved in championing the free speech bill, which is a piece of legislation to protect free speech, to encourage and enable debates like this. So I think both have their place in a healthy civic society.
Dominique, you've looked the decision makers in the eye. Did you find that they were more interested in hearing from you in a private room, or they wanted to, or they felt the impact of what you did on a big stage?
I really think there is a mix, and I think the role of public protests, it's really powerful in mobilizing and rallying a lot of people together and getting the message out there, getting the media attention, and also as a starting point for building communities who care about that issue. And that is where the real grassroots action happens. After kind of a one-off protest, it's where is the sustained campaign going, and how is this now going to apply pressure? And when I've been in these rooms, whether that is in Parliament or at the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, the COPs, speaking to decision makers in face to face, there is always an acknowledgement that one of the reasons they are now maybe pushing more for climate and climate justice within the work that they do is because of the public pressure. And I think it ties in so well, but also, it can be a longer process when you are being an activist kind of within an institution. And I think the two mesh so well together. I don't think they can, be without the other. And I think there's a tendency to maybe look at public protests and kind of look at it more in the short term of how quickly have they been able to rally support and if they have managed to get the government to listen. But in some cases, it's actually, we managed to get these different politicians in a room, managed to get these decision makers on board, and now we're able to build this case more effectively. So I think it's definitely difficult to just have public protest, and the long sustaining community building is at the heart of successful activism.
Thank you. We're going to have to deal with the very difficult question, I think controversial question, of what the appropriate limits of activism are. But before we go there, and without wanting to invite a reopening of the should we stay a member of the European Union or leave the European Union debate, bearing in mind it came up, would anyone on the floor who may have been on a second referendum march or may have been a Brexit voter who felt affronted by them like to engage on that? A question or a very brief reflection. So I think that there's a hand just in front of me, please. How did you feel by those marches?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was a very active and strong and heavily involved activist during the referendum campaign. I think it was a complete waste of everybody's time that we did what we did, because nobody debated after the referendum a single word of the issues that were raised that the referendum was supposed to be about. The referendum was about our membership of the EU, as it was. Sorry, as it was in 2016. All of the discussion after the referendum was all about whether we liked Farage or not, or whether we should redo the referendum. We couldn't redo the referendum for lots of reasons, but one of them was, once we'd left, we'd left. We can't go back into the EU at the moment because we're a member of the CBTPP, and actually you can't be a member of two different trade federations like that. So why are they pushing for it?
Sure.
Sorry, let me just finish. Farage argued that this was going to be the easiest negotiation in history, or whatever the words were. Well, it wasn't, because after the referendum had taken place, the whole nature of the debate transformed itself. It was entirely managed by people shifting their position, what went on for the following 4 years or 5 years, whatever it was, until we came out, was entirely about the way in which the politicians concerned conducted their own negotiations with each other.
Sure. I think we've got the gist of the point, which might be that one of the reasons why these marches didn't work is because they weren't necessarily addressing the real debate that had to be done. I think we should move on and we should discuss the limits of activism. And I'm hoping Alina is here with a question. I was told Alina might be here, but maybe not. Okay, in which case I'm going to read Alina's question out, which I have, which is, are governments increasingly desensitized to large non-violent protests? What may explain this? And perhaps more pertinently, is this a problem? So panel, non-violent protests versus, well, maybe not violent protests, but let's say law-breaking protests. How do we feel about the prospect of protesters breaking the law? Where is the place for that? And in fact, I've just reminded myself that we have Baroness Chakrabarti to give us an answer.
Of course there are limits, reasonable limits on activism, because we are social creatures and the rights and freedoms of others are hugely important. There are legal limits and then there are ethical limits. And both are important because I understand and respect that sometimes when activism is unfairly repressed in a state, activists may take a decision to breach the law. But when they do that, the ethical limits become even more important. For example, protest is being limited all over the world, including in the UK. Someone chooses to breach anti-protest laws, they nonetheless have to be guided ethically, including by the rights and freedoms of others. Sometimes activists act as whistleblowers, breaching their contracts of employment or breaching official secrets legislation, doing other things that are contrary to law. It's at that point that ethical limits become incredibly important, because the person who's chosen to be an outlaw, and when they feel the legal limits are unfair, now has to take responsibility for the actions that they are performing. So, I don't know, the so-called freedom fighter that attacks the dictator's arsenal should be thinking about protecting lives and not putting lives unnecessarily at risk, perhaps targeting the arsenal, perhaps targeting property, but really trying to safeguard human life. When you choose to be an outlaw, you take on a greater responsibility. You don't absolve yourself of it.
So, to be clear, I'm not inviting anyone on this stage to admit to breaking the law in the pursuit of any of their activistic ends. But let's start with Dominique. Where is the correct line between pushing the law to its limits and overstepping it? Is it ever justified, and in what circumstances might it be okay?
I think this is a really interesting question, especially as obviously from my point of view, the activism I'm talking about or saying that is justifiable is one that is aiming for the betterment of society through social and climate justice. So I have my perspective, and what I do believe activism that is focusing on creating a more progressive society. I think, as I mentioned earlier, when you exist in a society where there is further crackdown on activism and it's stripping, human rights away, and the, protesting is a right that we do have under democracy. And I think when you're in that position, as was just mentioned, it makes complete sense that people then take to breaking the law. And I think where the line is looking at, for example, we have, non-violent civil disobedience is, it's non-violent, but that also, it doesn't just include kind of mandated protests where, they get the permission from the police, for example, but it also includes maybe that, breaking property, maybe that's breaking into somewhere, maybe that is really doing something a bit more radical. And when we talk about the limits in terms of, public opinion, I think that's a different question, because I do think there is a conversation to be had there. But I think I'd also like to hear from some of our panelists how they feel about the current case that's ongoing, that's very relevant when it comes to the activists for Palestine, and trying to make a huge point about stopping these jets.
Yeah, so I think two particularly important points come out of that answer. One relates to this idea of non-violence and whether that is an appropriate ethical limit. I think Shami might have been articulating some sort of limit along that line when talking about human life. But let's go, I'm just going to work my way down the line this time. So if we can go to Munira next, do you think that non-violence, or at least certainly violence against humans rather than perhaps property, is the right ethical limit if you can't stay within the law, or do you think it needs to stay within the law?
Well, as I said before, I think there's a difference between living in a democracy and not living in a democracy. We don't in the UK have a huge crackdown on protests. I know a lot of people would argue that. I don't think that's true. I think we've had protests every week in central London since October the 7th that I've seen. What we have seen is quite disruptive tactics that affect public order, and the police have to use their powers in order to try and prevent that level of disruption. We've also seen actual violent protest, and I'm quite surprised that the courts have been, in some cases, have appeared to look quite leniently on those protests, on those, and in some cases, acts of violence. On the grounds that they're sympathetic with the cause. I think that's a problem. I think courts have to be impartial. And just as I would say that...
Well, so sorry to interrupt you for a second. When we say the courts, are you referring to sort of the decision of juries, or are you referring to judicial decisions?
So certainly there have been judges who have argued that the cause of protesters is so compelling that they feel that the sentencing or the decision has to reflect that. But I just as I would argue, I would argue against disruptive tactics or violence, used by people arguing for the cause of Palestine. I would argue against the need for that. I would also argue against people who are attacking hotels where asylum seekers are living. I don't think that's justified either. I think you have to be consistent. And whatever you think about the particular cause, I think the tactics that are used, the legal system should treat them consistently. And that's a really important part of it. And lots of people, I think, will argue for activism, for the kind of activism that they like, that they support and agree with, but then will apply a different standard to different political causes.
Okay, so just before we move on to Federica, can I ask then, if we're saying certainly not violence against other humans, and even criminal damage, the breaking of property, not acceptable, there are certainly forms of law breaking that don't even involve damage to property. So the blockading of the public highway, for example. Would you suggest, is it your position that even that would be unacceptable, or is there any degree of lawless protesting that you'd be prepared to accept?
No, not in a democracy. So, and these things are not victimless crimes. So there are examples of, the Dartford crossing was closed for about 2 days. 600,000 cars are affected by that. People trying to get to work, people trying to get to hospitals. I remember being on London Bridge a few years ago. There was I think it was an Extinction Rebellion protest. There was a disabled guy trying to get to work. Right? That's not a victimless crime. And I think there is a perception from a lot of activists that their cause is so just that they're prepared to ignore the human cost. Now, I have absolutely no problem with people protesting against the EU referendum or in favour of environmentalism. It's absolutely right in a democratic culture. But we have systems, we have ways in which we can make the trade-off. They're done through processes that allow the police and the authorities to judge when roads can be closed, to allow for alternative routes.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take answers from our 2 remaining panelists on that point. And then if you do have a question or a very, very brief comment that you'd like to throw into the mix, I'm going to go back to the floor then. So Federica, next, please.
I think my answer to that question is complicated. It depends. I totally agree with the point that in a democracy, it's a system of governance that requires and respects the rule of law, and it is about a social contract between people and their representatives and institutions that works within certain parameters, and those parameters should be transparent. And so, protests that break those parameters, that go beyond those parameters, should not be the favored type of method. But the reason why I said it depends is because all of this is conditional on the fact that we're talking about a fair contract between the people and the institutions. And it's the problem with democracies losing, their ground and becoming slightly more unhealthy across time is that it's often invisible. It's very hard to track when democracies start losing their healthy state. And so when it becomes more visible, it may be too late sometimes for the more progressive, peaceful movements to be effective. And so again, it's very context dependent, and I don't want to generalize, but and I'm not here to cheer for violence, but
that's a great relief.
yeah, but I think that we should also acknowledge that around us, like look at Europe. I'm from the continent. There's a lot of democracies, and it's not just under stress. The problems really come from the inside. It's the loss of some healthy grounds and some healthy pact between the people, the voters, and the representatives. When this goes rogue, then it's really then activism might be justified, I think, to go and bend the legal rules.
I've got a particular question for Shermar, but I can see Munira might just want to come back in on that. Sorry, I didn't. We will try and do it very quickly, and then we will go to the floor. Munira, do you have a very brief response to that?
Well, we just talked about several examples where activism has worked. And I don't think it's the case that A to B marches, the traditional protest march is redundant anymore. I think it's still effective. It's just some causes don't win. Some protesters don't win, and we have to accept that.
Okay, very briefly then, Shermar. Actually, you have your time.
Yeah.
When you're advising students, JCR presidents, activists, around the limits of what they should be doing and the efficacy of what they can do, broadly speaking, what is your position on this?
Well, it's a very interesting question because I think when judging activism, there are two ways of judging it, which are linked, but I think it's very important to separate it. There's the sort of positive, will this work or not, right, which requires a sort of, not really arrogance, but yeah, an arrogance, a sort of knowledge of, this is X will not lead to Y. But there's also the normative, which goes back to the question on, what the limits are. Like if it's a sort of lazy example, but like if it was the case that we were in like some sort of, and this is not going to be the case for JCR presidents, but if you were in some sort of oppressive, autocratic regime, we'd all like to say that in that situation, we'd fight against it and sort of martyr ourselves for it. But the reason why I say that they're linked is that, if you are doing an action which, either I believe or you believe will not actually lead to the outcome you want, then it's no different to not acting, because the outcome is the same, if not counterintuitive. Is a bit like you were saying before about, many scholars now say that the suffragette movement, the more violent approach was less effective, and it was sort of counterintuitive. But you can only know these things in retrospect, right? And it does require you to believe that exactly how the outcome is going to be to make that call. So in that situation, if I was advising a student, I'd like to think that the forms of not violent but extreme protests that we have seen just simply aren't effective. But that's me, sort of taking a leap based on my knowledge and information. If it was the case, and I don't think it is the case, so it's a sort of non-reality that what they were going to do was going to result in that, and I did believe in that cause myself, then I would advise for it. But just for the sake of, I know the Vice-Chancellor's here, I would not advise any student to do anything like that.
So, we've got 9 minutes to go. Clearly, the audience want to ask some questions on this point. What we might do is try and take a couple of quick questions in a batch, and we'll go through the panelists, and then we'll have one last 4 or 5 minutes on one last question from me. So, first up, please, could we get a microphone to the second row, if possible? Thank you very much. And if anyone else has a question, please stick your hand up, because we will try and bunch them together. Please.
I really enjoyed this discussion. There we go. On activism as it relates to democratic norms. So I'm very curious, in a time when geopolitical stability is being increasingly challenged by democratically elected leaders, how can activism resist being characterized as extreme, fringe, or partisan, and reclaim its role as a credible voice of the public?
Okay, thank you. We can answer that. We'll take another couple of questions if there are any. There's one over here, please, if that's okay. And then there's someone on the first row of the amphitheatre as well. So we'll go here first, and we'll then take 3, if we can remember them all.
Okay, thank you. My question is on a slightly different tack. It's about backlash, if that's okay.
Yep.
I'm very rooted in the second wave of feminism, and we experienced backlash when we wanted childcare. We were told we were bad mothers. When we wanted equal pay, we were told that we were putting men out of work. But we didn't have all the impact that social media has now. And so I'm wondering what experiences you've had of backlash and how personally you managed to cope with it.
Okay, and maybe one more question if... I'm not sure if the mic is working.
It's on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to mention Palestine Action, and I'm surprised nobody mentioned that. That was classified as a terrorist organization, and today have been classified without having done any crime when invaded Elbit's system, and also the impressive demonstration of the older people that have been supporting Palestine Action, so young people will not be labeled as terrorists. So how does that fit with the UK not being...
Okay.
I want to know how does that fit with the UK not being a repressive system toward activism?
Okay, so they were 3 very good questions, and what I think I'll do is I won't invite everyone up here to answer all of them. I'd first be interested just to know from Dominique and then from Shermar on that backlash question. How do you feel when you're putting yourselves forward in the public eye, you're pushing for change that you believe in? Not everyone is going to accept that. So first of all, Dominique, what has some of the backlash been like, and how does that affect your approach to activism going forward?
I think there's been, well, I have faced a lot of backlash, especially from kind of climate deniers, but also from, I think, people who don't quite understand or haven't linked together the links between the climate crisis and what is like very much happening now in terms of different social justice issues, and also when I've kind of spoken out against connected climate issues such as racial justice and gender justice and extractivism, I have faced a lot of backlash for that. And I think my approach is really focusing on, is keeping the focus on what I'm trying to achieve and what I want to do. There is a certain level of engagement, but that really happens when things are in good faith. And I really quickly just wanted to go to the point that someone mentioned, as I think it ties into backlash as well, on Palestine Action. That is something that I touched on before, and why I do believe there are points where people do feel they need to break the law in that way. I see, how people every week have been holding signs saying that they support Palestine Action and they are against genocide, and it's something that I do very, very much support in that way. And I think, we don't have time to go back to the question about the appropriate forms of protest, but I definitely wanted to bring that up that someone said.
Thank you. So, Shermar, in particular, as a young person, backlash, how have you found it and how do you respond to it?
Well, it depends on where the backlash is coming from, right? So if I were to give sort of a personal example, when I was president of the undergraduate body at my college here, when I was sort of resisting a change from the college, and you got backlash from the college, like, well, you sort of expect that. So backlash in itself doesn't necessarily mean anything, and if you think the cause you're, fighting for is, you know, a legitimate one, then backlash is just sort of accepted, and you just sort of have to power through it, right? If you sort of, you know, back down at the sight of any backlash, then, you know, sort of you're not really an effective actor there. So might not be a very satisfying answer, but yeah, it depends on where it comes from and how it affects. And, you know, if it's the case that the backlash is resulting in what you're fighting for not being effective anymore, then that is an opportunity to reflect and change course.
Okay, I've got 4 minutes left, so I think what I might do is go to Federica first on the question of, well, you were asked 3 questions. If you have any particular answers you want to go, I think now's the stage with 3 minutes to go to answer any of them.
I guess I think I want to pick up just briefly on the point about social media, because we didn't talk about the media at all. And I am a bit obsessed with this idea that we need to figure out our democracy before we figure out what are the appropriate ways to question power within our democracy. And I think that the point about what the media is doing to the way we behave in society, it's something that requires a lot more thinking and a lot of, hard critical questions. I think that some of the backlash actually in many ways is engineered by the way we narrate our role in society, and the media plays obviously that fundamental role in telling us how we should behave, where and how. So I think there's a lot there to, in trying to make our democracy more resilient to the fact that we can be able to live through waves of mobilization and activism. We also have to ask ourselves what the media is doing to our democracy.
Thank you. Munira, I have 2 minutes left before I disappear. So you have about 90 seconds if you want it, and you've got 3 questions you can answer.
Okay, I think the way to deal with backlash is politics requires courage and it requires resilience. We run programs to encourage more young people to go into public life, and that's one of the key messages. It also requires what Dominique described as engagement. It requires listening to your opponents and taking their arguments seriously. And I believe very much in free speech. I think it's absolutely right that people can protest against government policy. And I would encourage that and think our laws should reflect that. And there's more I could say about specific examples. I'm sorry we can't talk more.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much. Are there any incredibly brief last comments that anyone wants to make? In which case...
So much pressure.
Too much pressure. In which case, I have a huge stack of questions that the audience pre-submitted that I wanted to ask as well. And I think it's been testament to the quality of the answers we've had and the really interesting topic we've been debating that I haven't nearly got through anywhere near as much as I'd like to. But I'd like to thank all of our panelists for giving such interesting and enriching answers. And thank you, the audience, for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them, but hopefully you feel like you've heard some interesting stuff. So if you would join me in thanking our panelists by applauding. And I'm going to now humbly hand over to Professor Tim Soutphommasane to wind up the evening.
Thank you very much, Julius. I'm Tim Soutphommasane, Chief Diversity Officer for the university. And a big thank you to Julius and the panel and to you tonight. I think we only scratched the surface there in our discussion, so hopefully you have some material to take to your evening. 3 things stood out from the discussion tonight for me. One was the question of the ethical and legal limits of activism and protest, a particularly pertinent set of questions for us given climate activism and also Palestine action in the current environment. I think we heard too from the panel about what protest and activism says about the health of our democracies. Again, lots of questions for us to ponder there. And if there was one thing I took out of tonight, it was the question around the measure of what counts as successful activism. And I heard from a number of our panelists that the measure of success may not necessarily lie in the short run or the short term, that you might fail to win the battle, but you might ultimately win the war on ideas. And activism might be truly about seeding ideas for change. And we hope that tonight we've seeded some ideas for you. Looking ahead, we hope you enjoyed tonight, and we hope that you will join us again. And on the 20th of May, we have our Trinity Sheldonian Series event, and we're continuing on the theme of power. We've had sessions so far on the power of activism. Tonight, we heard about the power of speech last term. Next term, we're going to be reflecting on the power of satire, and we've got a great panel lined up, and it's going to be moderated by our very own William White, Professor of Social and Architectural History. That's the 20th of May, 5:30, right here. We hope that you can join us. And in concluding, I wanted to say a few thank yous. A big thank you to you, our audience. You were really engaged tonight. I was pleased to hear some hears, taking on board Julius Grower's encouragement. I heard some boos as well. That's okay too. And it was great to hear some of the questions from our audience. A big thank you to our events team who do a monumental job in putting together events like these. So to our events team, also to officers from the Proctor's office who've been involved, to our Sheldonian theatre staff as well. I want to thank some of the organisers involved in tonight, so David Isaac, Beth Botwright, Heidi Johansson-Berg. And last but not least, a big thank you to our moderator tonight, Julius Grower. Julius, I hear today's looking for a new interview and presenter. And thank you to our panellists, to Dominique, to Munira, Federica and Shermar. Will you please join me once more in showing our thanks to our panel tonight?